ways, I couldn't have asked for a better lead-in. You know, we're talking about rationalizing Jira, reporting. Oh yeah. So what I do, in my background, I'm Joel Foner. I've been an Agile coach for years, but you know, when people ask what I do at parties, you know, I'll eventually back into saying I'm an Agile coach, and the next question is, oh, so you do like yoga and stuff, right? Well, kinda. It's more like organizational therapy in the guise of technical work. So what I'm doing is helping people figure out how to do better. Often we think about something like Jira as a tool that is just for tracking the work, just for keeping track of what's going on, figuring out whether it's done. You know, those big questions. When is it going to get done? Is it going to get done? I look at Jira in a very different way. I'm just curious, how many people have seen The Matrix? Yeah, a bunch of us, right? You know the big displays, right? The big displays with all the characters coming down, and there's that one scene where the operator is looking at it saying, you know, all I see is these green characters. Whoa, that's a great scene. Well, when I look at Agile metrics, that's kind of the way I think about it. To me, Agile metrics tell me how and what the teams are doing to get the work done, more so than what work is getting done. So we're going to talk about this other perspective today on how you can unleash improvement using Agile execution metrics. Because the other stuff is buried there in plain sight. So we'll take a look here at a few things. You know, one of the big questions, how are we doing, right? How are we doing from a project perspective is often those couple things we talked about. You know, all anybody a couple clicks up cares about is it's going to get done. One way of figuring that out is like this, right? Okay, let's print a few thousand pages of data. That's how we're doing. That doesn't really help. Well, it's got to be simpler, right? It's got to be simple. Okay, how's this? Is this better? Not really, right? But often status reports are nothing more than this, right? It's you net it down to one number. Oh yeah, we're at 87.5%. Awesome.
Better than half.
Better than half. Yeah, better than half. We're almost there. So, but you know, maybe something visual would help. Maybe we need to see some patterns and trends to understand what's going on. But there's a starting point. And Jonah pointed at this, right? The data cleanliness and components and all that stuff. I can't count the number of teams and projects I've worked with, and I ask, how is your data? Oh, we think our data's good. Seriously? So one of the projects I'm working on, you might have heard about this in a previous session that we had, is a data warehouse kind of project. It's 14 teams. They seem to keep expanding like the bunny rabbit farm. But we're up to about 14. It's work that involves a significant project with a bunch of zeros behind it in terms of funding in a major insurance company. So in terms of structure, we've talked about, you know, you talked about different ways to structure things. In this company, what they do is they have, when you're operating as a program, like this, these 14 teams are aligned towards one common set of goals. They're all doing interdependent work. It's all in one Jira project. And there's a custom field called ITT. And that's how you decide which team the work goes with. So there's a whole bunch of boards in that project, and the work is tagged with ITT. Now, when I first saw this, I thought, oh no. You know, I've come to appreciate it. There are some things that are really positive about it. There are some things that aren't so great because Jira has no concept of IT team as something that matters. It's just a custom field. But you know, the thing that's common, whether you do it this way or any other way, is you kind of wonder how good your data is. So I started talking about how I'm seeing a lot of user stories that don't really look too good. You know, they have a funny smell. They're missing stuff. And I was in these leadership team meetings, and they'd say, you know, like a lot of this is outsourced, and the vendor manager for the outsourced team would say, no, you're accurate. Okay, fine. Rather than having those arguments, one day I sat down and did a couple of JQL queries to take a look at some things. Really basic stuff. Like, is there any description on the user story? Any at all, even one character. Well, it turned out that out of 800 or 900 user stories, 300 something didn't have any description at all. And showing that one number, remember it's sometimes one number, showing that one number caused the biggest silence I'd heard in that leadership meeting for a while. Because everybody, even if they don't know Agile, they don't know much about projects, they know that if almost half of your work has no description, it might not be a good thing. So this turned into expanding that. What you're looking at here is a structure board. Actually, how many of you have worked with structure at all? A little bit? Some? Okay, good. So underlying structure is all kinds of capabilities, some of which are obvious, some aren't. It all of a sudden occurred to me, you know, wow, I could use this as a convenient way to present quality of user stories, just from a quick data check perspective. So if you look from the top, we've got stuff like, oh, no fixed version, but work in open sprints. What does that mean? You're working on something and it's not connected to any release at all. Even though we're running scaled Agile, so there's this concept of a program increment, a PI, it should at least be attached to the current PI. And no fixed version means we don't know where this is going when it's due. How about no fixed version, no IT team assigned? No IT team assigned in this world means it's totally orphaned. It's not showing up on anybody's board. That's not good. We'll talk about this much later, closed stories with open pull requests. How many of us have worked with Git or Bitbucket and know what a pull request is? Half and half. Okay, so we'll talk in more detail about that. I stumbled on this in kind of a backwards way. And it was another one where I showed the stat and people were like, how can that be? So the idea behind this is, again, it's not so much, is the work done? It's what does this tell us about how we're doing the work? Are we doing a clean job at doing the work? And then there are some more that are PI-specific checks, you know, orphaned issues. Oh, unestimated stories. I have another one that I didn't show on this slide, is unestimated stories in open sprints. You know, you get the pattern, right? We're looking for basic structural checks. These are not rocket science, they're not brain surgery. But until you put the numbers behind it, everybody assumes it's not very bad. In our case, we use epics and upper layer stuff. You know, how much stuff is not tied out to an epic. Then I started digging a little bit deeper, saying, you know what about acceptance criteria? We have an acceptance criteria field. How many of these things didn't have acceptance criteria? Well, of course, back at that time when I found that there were 300 that were missing description, there were even more that had no acceptance criteria. Does this all sound good? Not really, right? The interesting thing is, now I'm talking about triggering change, right? It's less about the stuff and more about triggering new thinking and reframing. Just by showing this, the initial reaction was bury it, you're wrong, whatever. But by a few weeks later, people were starting to say, huh, okay. Now we just finished the second program increment planning, so we're going into the second 10-week cycle with this group. Now we've managed to trigger a world in which they are frantically trying to get all the data clean and make sure we're operating clean. And I'll show you how we got there. But I guess I'm asking you to hold this duality in mind, right? The is it getting done versus the what can I learn about the operation from it? Let's see, the other ones are pretty, things in our world, things that are ready for release but not yet closed. You know, if you've, in our world, unlike yours, it's many thousand people on one Jira cluster, one instance, with 5 layers of handcuffs on the central team that controls things. I mean, I just went through a 3-try cycle to get one custom field added, and the cycle time by the time it'll be done is about 90 days. Now, the good news is they're very good at governance. The bad news is it kind of can be over the top. So we have one workflow for the whole company, which has a whole bunch of states that a lot of people don't need and don't use. Which causes all kinds of need for more diagnostics. But the point being here, the nice thing about structure is it lets you present this in a really concise way that's expandable. And so in a meeting context, We start with everything collapsed, and then something of interest you expand to look at. And you'll notice over here there's this column that says count leaves. That's one, I'm being yelled at to stay on camera, but I also have to point for the people who look. So when you look at count leaves, which many people haven't stumbled on before, what that does is count all the lowest level items and sum them up. So when you're doing this kind of presentation, you can roll it all up and people can see which things do I care about just by gross counts. Right? Questions, by the way. Any questions? Feel free, interactive. So, yeah, go ahead.
When you show this to people, is it just for leadership, or is it? Are you showing it to folks that can implement this?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah. Yeah. The Scrum Masters have access to this, and they are reminded of this on a regular basis, and reminded that the leaders are seeing this on a regular basis, and it's a nice self-reinforcing. Let's keep things clean. Yeah. Actually, though, and the way this was done is in structure. You can have separate queries for each folder. Right. I created a bunch of folders here. So that way you can do things that are not just a roll-up. I know on the start, when I started working with structure, I thought about it just as a roll-up of all consistent things. This allows you to do slices in all kinds of different directions and put them together into a view. So some things aren't in the data, like impediment and risk tracking. But for both of these, we had created classic JIRA dashboards before. You know, with the lists and the 2x2 lists and all that. And I found that nobody would engage in looking them. The people just, I'm not quite sure what it was. I think it was just they were too long, too big. It just felt like too much. The minute I flipped this stuff into structure so it was a collapsible outline, people started paying attention and actually using it. So one thing to think about is just sort of the psychological side of, you may know what the data looks like and what it means in a big table, but maybe presenting it in a collapsed, easy to consume way makes it something people actually act on. Questions before we move on? Yeah.
Did you manage your obstacle or impediment within JIRA associated with the user stories, or how did you manage that?
Yeah, good question. How do we manage impediments and risks? We did manage it within JIRA. Basically, one of the other coaches had come up with a thought for how to do this, where we had 3 different techniques for tagging things. The stuff in the top section, interprogram, which means stuff outside of the program. So outside of these 14 teams, let's say, as an example, team A can't get something done because some operations team needs to deploy some new servers, right? That's an outside impediment. That would be, there's a field that's an external impediment, I think, that they had added with a description field. And so if you chose anything other than none for that field, that's the filter for this top section. The next section down looks for links between stories of a certain type. It's looking for a blocked by link between things. And then the bottom section, which I didn't show in here, is inside the team impediments, if they wanted to list those, which were just blocked stories. Flagged stories. Right? So what we're basically doing is saying we have 3 approaches to tagging these things, and that lets us separate them out into separate blocks. Risks were just the risks. We created a risks artifact type in JIRA, and I always put those in the top section because I wanted it above the fold when we're talking to leadership, as opposed to distributed out through. So we had one view of this, which is by team, another one that's all aggregated together without the team split out. The reason the team view is mostly what was used is that the teams were quasi-specialized. You had like 2 or 3 teams working on a particular thing, and so usually those issues were pretty local to the teams. Does that help? Yeah, great. Other questions? Yeah.
The data set that you're showing, did you do backlog refinement up front, or are you doing backlog refinement all along? Because you mentioned like acceptance criteria, maybe the story is.
Yeah. So the other, good point. What does this say about backlog refinement, right? That's an example of exactly what I'm talking about. Using metrics to look at behavior patterns, right? This program started as a non-agile program. When I started working with them before we decided to do a release train launch and go to SAFe, they were just spinning up teams. They went from 0 teams to 2, I think, 3, something like that, by the time they decided to do SAFe. About 6 or 8 months later, we now have 9 development teams and 4 or 5 between architecture, systems, and infrastructure, which is just a huge explosion of stuff. We originally started with technical architects as product owners. We had the discussion about business and that kind of thing, and after some number of sprints, one of the leads said, you know, Joel, maybe we should think about having somebody a little bit more business focused be the product owners. And so they brought in some folks who were BAs, but they had never been product owners before. They hadn't really worked with Agile before. So what part of this is, this was used as the triggers for helping people to learn how to, by pointing at the stuff that's not there. And it makes it much more workable than just being in a scrum and noticing something. The notice is important, but you don't have any metrics behind it for how often is this. Does that help?
Yeah, I was just curious, like you had stuff earlier that, depending on how you interpret the data, the stories may not have been refined, so they may not.
Absolutely.
Should be in that category.
Yep, and that's a really good point. The filtering really matters. The first time I threw these together, for instance, some of the ones that say in open sprints, yeah, I hadn't done it that way before. And folks pointed at exactly that. Joel, that's not fair. I mean, this is all stuff that we haven't even gotten to yet. Oh, okay, fine. Then let's take a look at what the stuff in open sprints looks like. Oh, there's still problems there. Yeah, agreed, good point. So you always want to think about what's that population you're looking at. Is it a reasonable slice?
Were you looking at the sprint backlogs that were either done or committed to in your data set here? Because right now you don't know whether, like you just mentioned, this is the whole project stuff that's not even started yet. Therefore, you might not have acceptance criteria. You might not have stuff
Yeah.
defined yet.
Yeah, after a while, what we basically did is filter all of those to be just for stuff that's in open sprints. So the presumption is, if it made it into an open sprint and it doesn't have this stuff, something's broken process-wise.
No, I agree with that.
Yeah.
The data set in general, I was just wondering
Yep.
what we're looking at.
Yep, it was kind of an evolution to get to what's the right mix of stuff. Yeah. Cool, thanks, good question.
Thank you.
Yep. So, you know, sometimes the problem is you can't see the forest for the trees, as they say. And when you have this many people, in our last PI planning, we had, I think, like 85, 95 people in the room, something like that. And with 12, 14 teams, there's enough stuff going on that it's really easy to focus on the leaves and not be able to see what's happening. In particular, there are some things in Jira that are cool, but maybe not so useful in that world. You know, you take a look at stuff like a release burn down or an epic burn down. It's great. One project, one team, works great. Now you take a whole bunch of teams and put them in one project and slice them this way, and you probably want a program team that has all the epics over there, and they're not distributed to the individual teams because epics may span multiple teams. And now you try to get burn downs that make sense, and the data doesn't work. So what I'm going to show you is some of how we got to the place of being able to see at scale within Jira without all kinds of messing around. There were a couple of approaches that I put together in Jira. There's some script runner functions that let you programmatically pull in anything related to the stories in a project. That worked, but it was slow. And basically, a month later, I looked at, oh, wait a minute, we have EAZYBI installed, which is a data visualization tool. It's like Tableau or Spotfire, but it has some deep knowledge about Jira. And our folks in the tools team had actually pre-worked some stuff so that you could pull in a basic cube that has most of what you need. Well, that's cool. So I put together a burn chart at the program level. So this is an example of triggering change, and you have to be careful what you ask for. This is from the first PI that they ever ran. Now, a couple of things. You'll notice at the beginning, the blue line is the number of story points estimated, and the green line is completed. So you notice the blue line was not loaded up at the beginning of the PI. In other words, we didn't start with a some amount and work towards completing it. We started down here. Now, I mean, I knew where they were starting from. This is a first PI. It's the first big planning event. They're barely learning how to walk. That's cool. But this raises a question. What are some possibilities for why that number started there and went up? What do you think?
Feature creep?
Could be a huge amount of feature creep, right? What else?
You didn't know what you were doing when you started.
Yeah, it's no clue. What direction, what road, the Alice in Wonderland project plan. right? What else?
Optimism.
Yeah, wild optimism. Yep, yeah. Now, it turns out the reality was that the product owners, again, remember these are new product owners, the teams were new. Some of the teams landed literally a day before the PI planning event. Didn't have any real way to estimate the overall size of what they were looking at. And so they were taking sort of the team level Agile approach of estimating as they went. They'd figure it out for the next sprint as they went. Now realize though, I showed this in a leadership meeting as here's this new visualization. It raises some questions. Where this got shown, I don't know if you can see where well, in any case, I'm going to walk over here for 1 minute, don't shoot me, was about here, the April 2nd line. Actually, a little bit before that. No, I'm sorry. I think it was around, here in March, where it looked like the demand, the number of points defined, was escalating at the same rate as the points completed, with no reason to suspect they're going to converge. It raised some alarm. It raised some theories that weren't necessarily data-backed, shall I say. It even got me accused of being unethical by showing bad data by a few parties who were not actually in leadership at the, yeah. So, I put all the caveats on when we talked about it. I said, look, there's a lot of explanations, including that we just don't know, the data's not clean, we got to figure out how to get the data clean, but look what we could know if we got the data to clean. We could understand whether we're going to hit the target on time. The good news is, about a month or so later, they're now triggered into, yes, we're going to make this work. Absolutely. And for this PI planning event, the product owners and all the teams did rough t-shirt estimates at the Jira Epic, say, feature size, to know what our starting load looks like, and are starting to talk about comparing train capacity to demand. Pretty cool, huh? And this wasn't by just jumping up and down and yelling, right? It was just showing a couple data points and asking some questions. Now, what else can you tell about the way this train operates by looking at this picture? Because you can tell something about train behavior from that picture.
Can they save everything up and close it at once or something? Is that the bumps on the green?
Yeah, right? What happened to this idea of closing stories in the middle of a sprint, right? So, but here's an interesting thing. It's tempting, if you're a team coach or a scrum master, you look at your team, you look at some other team, and you say, I have a team problem. We're not closing our stories in the middle of a sprint. What do we have to do to fix it? If you see the same pattern at scale, maybe it's a different problem. Maybe the root cause is elsewhere. Or it's just shared bad behavior, right? But in either case, it becomes a different kind of solution set if the at-scale view looks like the detail view. Okay.
Did anyone look at the individual burn downs?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
The teams to see what's going on?
Yeah. And I did, and that's where I kind of started with this. And it turned out that many of them were similar, some of them were different, some of them were actually doing really well, but in aggregate, and you can see there's some bumps here and there. And again, what I'm pointing at here is just this lens of looking at the data to see behavior instead of results. So other ways of trying to figure out, can't see the forest for the trees, a structure that does a roll-up from user stories to epics to initiatives. Again, just create a data type for that roll-up. So we can see percent complete. Now, one of the interesting things about progress in the progress calculation and structure is you can define what progress means, including you can decide whether you want to be Agile rigorous or not. This is set up so you get 0 credit until the thing is done. The default is you get 50% credit just for putting something into progress, in progress. I just said, no, credit on closure, that's it. And some people said that's not fair. And I pointed back to like how other things work, and they said, well, okay. So here's another one where this is in an insurance environment. You might want to see by subject area what's going on, right? So this one rolls up by epic by subject area, which in our case is component, like your components. So the idea here is being able to see from multiple perspectives what's going on at scale using a combination of structure and EAZYBI. The next one is an epic burn of a particular epic, and I call this, we spent a lot of time. The first PI, we didn't get this done at all. The epics were all sort of technical epics, really technical epics, like technical user stories. And then we got into this problem where people couldn't figure out how to do really cleanly, get reporting that looks like the way stakeholders care about. And we ended up with that discussion about, oh, maybe we need to reframe the epics to be like user stories. They're things that they care about. So now we have epics that actually look like what people care about. And so here's an EAZYBI burn chart of an epic across teams to see where that's headed. So I've got 10 minutes, 5 minutes? 7 minutes. Okay, got a pile of stuff I can go through. This was built from an expansion of a velocity chart sample with EAZYBI. I call it a better velocity chart because it shows you a little bit more of the story of what's going on. It shows you how many points were completed, how many added, what the change was, how many points were removed is the dark red. So you can start to see real patterns in what's going on over time, not just completion. So when you look at a team like this, the gray is story points not completed. You kind of look at that and say, what's going on here? And you look at this one and say, huh, what's going on there? The red is story points removed. Now it turned out that they were starting to realize that they just had pulled in a bunch of stuff that probably shouldn't have been in the PI, and the product owners were cleaning it out as they went through. But you could look at that, and if you looked at it naively, you could say, oh, the teams are screwing up. But these are questions, right? It raises questions. And then you look at this one and say, is this a healthy team? Gray is points not completed. Like poll, how many people think this is a healthy team? Does anybody think this is a healthy team? Would it surprise you if I showed you that this cumulative flow is the same exact team? Yeah, right? Because this looks pretty decent. It turns out that they were holding stories over the long term for various reasons. They weren't completing within the sprint, which kills the velocity chart, but the cumulative flow shows you the flow, the overall flow of what's getting done. So this is where you need more than one view to see what's happening. And so, yeah, go ahead, question?
Were they splitting stories?
Sorry?
Were they splitting stories? Were they carrying them?
They were carrying him, yeah. And they were carrying him for various reasons, but we've now dealt with that.
A lot of teams do do that.
Absolutely. Yep, yep. So what's the inner story behind this burn down chart? Did the team screw up? They closed all their points.
Yeah. Started the sprint before they did sprint planning, and then they waited a few days.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, the other thing is we always have to be careful about these metrics when we start thinking from a behavioral perspective. There are many, many possibilities for what happened. It could also be possible that this team didn't start at the beginning of the common sprint starts cadence, right? However, in that case, you're absolutely right, as they just weren't really doing sprint planning. Is this a team problem? What do you think? How many people think this is a team problem?
It's kind of a loaded question.
Sure. These are all trick questions. It's on purpose. That's the point I'm trying to make, right? Is this asks, it gives you insight into questions to ask about behavior. It turns out that this looks like a team that can't close anything to save their lives, but it turns out that their test environment was offline for 2 weeks. But it's an open question, right? Does this make you happy? Why not?
Closing everything at the end.
Hey, closing everything at the end. Oh, by the way, we started with 10 points
Yeah,
when you open the sprint. So a lot of new Scrum Masters need to understand that the second you click Start Sprint, that's your commit. You don't do that and then add the stuff, right? This one is actually pretty close to textbook, and that was one of the teams that's been around for a while. You can see that they're sizing stuff and executing, so they're closing things throughout the sprint. And then there are hidden secrets. Many people have not played with control charts before. What a control chart shows is time elapsed. The gray is sort of average, and the red is your average closure time. The blue is a rolling average. In other words, it takes a window and looks at that average. If you see a team like this, that the rolling average isn't changing too much, they're actually pretty stable. But then you look at the end. See that pattern at the very end where it's going up? That would not be visible somewhere else. It tells you there's something going on in team operation that's starting to slow down the closure pattern. Right? You also see that there are some outliers, but not a huge amount. What about this one? You know, much more variation in the rolling average, and a huge number of these way out of center kind of things. What about this one? Now it turns out the interesting thing is, look back up too. This one, this average is around 9, maybe 10 days. This one, the average is like 4. That's a pretty solid team, right? They're closing things quickly. Yes, there's some variation, but they have it reasonably under control. Here's one where you see a huge amount of diversity, but the rolling average is pretty consistent. So it's a question of which things you want to pay attention to. You know, some teams are going to have big variations, but I kind of look at it as if the rolling average is pretty consistent, they're doing a reasonable job. How about this one? A lot more variation. In particular, something happened out there at the beginning of April, right? See that huge splatter of stuff? Something happened out there. And so these are the things you can use to ask, what's going on with the way the team works, as opposed to, are we getting the work done? Last couple of things. Do I have 2 more slides? Yep, okay. So then we talk about releases. You know, what happens in releases? So what story does the release data tell you? Well, so here's a PI's worth of work. And this was very shortly before the release, before the end of the PI. And you know, I just casually presented this in a meeting and said, you know, we had 61 things in progress and 81 to do, and we are really close to supposedly being done. That has a smell to it. What's going on? All kinds of jumping up and down. You know, but actually I'm more concerned about the fact that we got a bunch of stuff that looks like we have open pull requests, even though we have closed user stories. And I mentioned this before. When you close a user story, it means you're done, right? An open pull request means that in Bitbucket, there is something open that never got closed in the source control world where developers work. How is it possible you're closing a story with open stuff in source control? Something's wrong with this picture. All kinds of, the data's bad. Okay, it's fine, let's take a look at it. You know, kind of my reaction was open pull request, but it got released? What? And if you have Bitbucket installed and integrated, and you have privileges on Bitbucket, you can click on that under review panel, the under review button. It'll bring up the list of open pull requests, and you can see which one is open, or which ones are open. When you get to release, when it's time to release, you should see nothing in progress, nothing to do, and no warnings, right? This has turned into an ongoing, yep, we're going to make this better, with all kinds of real improvements, and people now focused. Actually, this afternoon, just before I walked out the door to get here, was a meeting with the vendor program manager from the consulting company, making sure to walk all of the Scrum Masters through these kind of metrics, plus some others that have to do with churn, that are going to be reviewed by leadership, and they need to understand so that they will actually work to keep the data clean with the teams. And most of this was done, actually all of this was done, without the typical he said, she said kind of game, the emotion stuff that comes in. It was just, here's some data, what does this mean? So, thank you.